Thank you all so much for being here. I know there are lots and lots of other things to do, and I want to thank Anna May, especially for putting this wonderful conference together, for our colleagues from the University of Rabat joining us, which is fantastic, and being rejoined by wonderful collaborators and co-conspirators like Arash and Jinan, and also welcoming another collaborator, Christina Meyer, who's actually part of one of the projects I'm going to be talking about. My disciplinary lens is actually very interdisciplinary. I work from three different arenas. One is media studies and media history. The other one is comparative literary and cultural studies. And the third is intercultural communication. And for the work I do with AI in numerous projects, I actually use all three lenses to try and make sense of something that, to me, really is summarized by two concepts: context and process. So what I want to talk about in the time that is given to me is really three different case studies projects where I try to engage these understandings of concepts, context, and process, because I'm as much a learner and user and practitioners and critiquer of AI as we all are. And I very much go, just to sort of go with Fiona's request for definitions, go with Qasim's definition. You know, I'd really prefer to talk about LLMs. I'd really talk about pattern makers as the black box, algorithmically driven AI that we work with. Fortunately or unfortunately, we are held to now use culturally and interculturally the term artificial intelligence, even though it was a fairly haphazard invention in the 1950s by John McCarthy in the Dartmouth Conference, just a little bit up north here in New Hampshire. So the first project is a course I am currently co-teaching with Christina Meyer on cyborgs, robots, and androids in the German imaginary. I will introduce that shortly. The second project is a special issue that I'm leading as the introductory essay on intermediality, multimodality, and AI in contemporary literature, where I'm really trying to grapple with some of the topics that have already come up. What does it mean to be an author in today's literary composition context, whether you're an academic author or whether you're a creative author, or whether you're an author in the much wider sense of simply putting out content. And the third project is sort of, you know, a 3,000, 10,000 mile point of view, whereby I think what is emerging already from the communications we've had, where are we as humans in this endeavor that is algorithmically driven, that is calculatory, and that is data-driven, whereby I think we need to actually rev up how we communicate our humanities and our humanity in a data-driven, calculatory, quantitative world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Center for Humanities Communication that is Mellon-funded, and I'm one of four who are trying to get this off the ground. In this duality of context and process, I feel often jostled between guidelines and literacy. And we can talk about how literacy can also be defined as competency. Are we talking about literacy? Are we talking about competency? Are we talking about awareness? How do we actually want to define that? And what I tend to go with is the Center for AI and Digital Policy. They have set out, I see. Oh, wonderful. So we'll hear from you, I hope. Who've given us universal guidelines for artificial intelligence, and guidelines to keep in mind, especially when we start talking about ethics, when we start talking about access, when we start talking about intercultural awareness of different histories and different usages of artificial intelligence and LLMs, And also, number 8, for example, a public safety obligation, a cybersecurity obligation, prohibition on secret profiling. So all kinds of ethical, social, historical, and of course, global aspects where AI policy and AI guidelines should be in place. And how do we operate as researchers, as humans, as educators, in that, on the one hand, prescriptive use, critical use of AI, but also potentially regulatory and restrictive use of AI. The other definition that has guided me so far is by the National Association of Media Literacy Education. This is a US institution. The Center for AI and Digital Policy is very global. And I've simply rewritten their definition of media literacy, the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act, working with all forms of generative AI. So that can be a working definition, something that may work for you and may not work for you. And all I'm trying to sort of position here is, from the 3 disciplinary positions I'm looking at this, is how bound can I be, do I have to be, by ethical aspects, globally, locally, as an educator, as a human being, but then how much, to echo Anna May, can I also build? I want to experiment, I want to play. I don't want to just critique. So this is sort of some aspects that are important. So one of the case studies I'm presenting here today is our course, where Christina and I have a lot of fun translating the German imaginary around cyborgs, robots, and androids into experiments with AI and into 2025. Let me just read a short description of the course so you kind of see the positioning of the human, non-human. This course examines the figure of the non-human, human, and explores representations of artificial beings in German literatures, art, and cinema. The focus is on representations of artificial beings in the German imaginary, with a focus on issues of technology, art, philosophy, and subjectivity, media history and theory, and intercultural awareness. So when we look at writings by Leibniz, his monadology, Laroche, the machinery of her writing table, Goethe's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Kleist's The Theater of the Marionette, or Hoffman's The Sandman, some of you may be familiar with that, or Metropolis as the first movie that really plays with the idea of the automaton, the robot, in 1927. How can we translate these imaginaries, whether they're fears, whether they're fantasies, whether there's early sci-fi, into the kind of real world problem solving around today's students' tasks and challenges? And I should mention that this course is also part of my being a career fellow with the Career Center. So we're trying very hard to bring in the NACE competencies around teamwork, around critical thinking, around technology, around leadership, and I've chosen 3 to go with. So when Christina and I put our head together, we're looking at designing a robot to solve a real-world problem by really translating The Sorcerer's Apprentice into student tasks of, well, you know, what happens if you have a machine that goes crazy and the broom doesn't want to actually work with your prompt because you are not the magician, you are the apprentice, and you're the apprentice of the AI. How do you make the machine not go wild and the black box actually somewhat maneuverable, that you can work with a machine, that you don't fill the house with water, for those of you who are familiar with the poem or the Disney movie. We also, based on the Theater of the Marionette, the text by von Kleist, have given the students prompts of cutting the strings, framing your competencies beyond the puppet stage. So we don't just talk about cyborgs, robots, and androids. We also sort of extend that into homunculi, into puppets, into the kind of imaginary around where is this human artificial interface, and what kind of intercultural and cultural imaginaries are wound around that. If you look at the history of puppetry, UConn is a perfect place to do that. You will see lots and lots of different formations of puppets around the world, whether it's on the African continent, the Asian continent. We had a colleague from LCL come in who's a 12th generation shadow puppeteer and talked about what puppets mean in his historical sort of meaning making, whether it's religious or whether it's cultural. So we really take this into all kinds of different arenas, but we then focus it on AI and the use of AI to sort of bring it into the students' everyday imaginary and practical usage for the classwork, but also for their training towards a career. And the last step was exploring creativity in AI. This was specifically, I think you mentioned it, or you mentioned it about prompt writing. How do we teach our students how to write prompts? This is not something that comes naturally. So in this course, this is something we very much are trying to integrate based on giving the students the understanding that these imaginaries are not new. Anxieties around AI, if they're such, are not new. And the experimentation of the machine-human interface also is not new. In Germany, it goes back with the homunculi into the 16th century and earlier. But if you go to some Chinese human interface, it goes back over 1,000 years, thinking of automatons especially. The other project I'm currently involved with is, as I mentioned, the introduction to a special on intermediality, multimodality, and AI in literature. And we're sort of casting a wider net because what I would strongly advocate for is a definition of media authorship in this age where we're not just authoring from a human individual, possibly in the past sort of talent or genius-based position. We're collaborators, we're co-authors, and we have been co-authors for a long time. So when I defined media authorship in 2021 in a different article, I really want to call awareness to the multimodality, to the bricolage, to a getting out of the tight framework of genius or talent of skills or viable access to the market. Media authorship, I argue, emerges as fragmenting, in process, multiple, and most of all, as conspiring with contemporary media. So where are we as authors, no matter which discipline we're in that context of contemporary media? And some of us will embrace trying authorship and media authorship formats with AI and other media. Others will shy away. And Anna-May, we just talked about policies. What kind of policies are part in that restrictive versus creative fields of possibility of actually figuring out, well, what kind of author am I? And am I cognitively offloading? I know we'll hear about that a little bit, simply because there's a fear of writing, the fear of the imaginary, the fear of the constrictive, of the formal. So this is something we can talk about. But when we think about AI in literature and we think about AI and authorship in flux, I think it's very interesting to start thinking about what kind of gradations of AI usage can we attach to authorship in general? Do we have to insist, like the Authors Guild of the US, the sign of the sort of a domain of written by humans for humans, or is that in fact too restrictive? Lastly, I would like to call attention to the Center for Humanities Communication. And this is, again, sort of a much broader circle of bringing the humanities alongside the sciences, and here too, trying to bridge the gap between the two cultures that have been talked about for more than 100 years, for over 100 years now, but trying to figure out, well, how can we communicate about the humanities similar to how the sciences also have a field of science communication, especially at a time when the human becomes really part of the center around AI discourse. What is human? What is not human? What is hybrid? What are androids, robots, automatons? How do we define this kind of usage around the humanity? And I want to just give one example where we also should become more information literate in the humanities by making you aware of the fact that data actually is a humanities term. We use data on a daily basis. We're data-driven, but data in the general culture of the 17th and 18th century still evoked specialized kinds of argumentation and the special situation of argument. As the etymology of the word indicates, data is the neuter past participle of the Latin word dare, and it means very much an argument rather than what we today understand as data. So it's qualitative. It is not quantitative if you go to the origin of the word. I want to close with a working definition of AI literacy that I've constructed for myself, because the context matters for AI literacy and the process matters for AI literacy. So for me, the pursuit, if you're so inclined, and development of AI literacy depends on context, on access, and the hermeneutic and heuristic capacities to both critique and build. Thank you very much.